I'm going to run through this in a couple of framings. One is, why are we seeing such a fundamental disruption in the world today? What does it mean, and how will it change society? But then most importantly, what can we do about it? And so that's where I want to focus. I'm going to leave some time at the end for a good discussion, because I think that's where things become more interesting. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you are familiar with the Singularity University linear to exponential paradigm? Okay, many of you. Good. So I'm going to touch on a few of these. The really big question is, how do we fix our cities? And I'll explain why we focus there. You heard a lot about my background from Vicente. I'm actually Canadian, originally from India. I spent 10 years here in Europe restructuring large European organizations, many French companies, which is why I'm bold. And if you've interacted with French companies, that makes sense. But my journey really starts 12 years ago when I was in Silicon Valley. I was the head of innovation at Yahoo. And I learned a really fundamental lesson, which is now guiding much of our thinking, which is when you try disruptive innovation in a legacy environment, the immune system attacks you. Because all of our organizations, all of our institutions are built to resist change and withstand risk. And yet, disruptive change is now the high order bit. It is the driver. And how do we deal with that is almost all of the work that we do in our ecosystem. Probably the strangest phone call I've had was 2 years ago from the Vatican saying, look, Pope Francis has the oldest immune system in the world. His is 2,000 years old, and can we talk to you? So we've run some workshops there and so on. This is the fundamental chart that many of you, I hope, have seen. Ray Kurzweil put this chart together, which is basically Moore's Law. And he goes all the way back to 1900 and finds that we have been doubling computational price performance, not just every 18 months, but it's been happening for 110 years. And the question that he asked when he saw this curve and this data was, why is this curve so smooth and so predictable? In the last 100 years, we've had wars and recessions and ups and downs in the industry. You should expect a very jagged stock market type of shape. But this is incredibly steady and predictable. And he spent 10 years researching this and came to a fundamental conclusion that once you take a domain, discipline, industry area, product area, technology, and you power it with information technology, it acquires informational flow properties, and then the price performance starts doubling. Most importantly, once that doubling starts, that pattern does not stop. It just keeps going. And cognitively, we have a very difficult time with this because it should stop. It can't just keep going. But in computation, if you can see the bands, we've had multiple technologies. Each one is like an S-curve where technology accelerates, reaches its capabilities, but something else always takes over the curve. And we're actually reaching the end of the life cycle of integrated circuits today. Chips are getting very hot down at the surface levels. We're down to a few nanometers of wire thickness. But now we have a set of technologies at the edge, just about here, ready to take it to the next level. 3D chip design, optical computing, molecular bond computing, quantum computing, which requires a lot of alcohol to understand, so I won't get into it here. But basically, Moore's Law will continue. And we're entering a world of infinite computation, infinite storage. And how do we deal with that? And it led Peter to write this book, Abundance, basically charting out that if we can harness this acceleration and leverage it, we'll soon have an abundance of clean water, healthcare, energy in about a decade. And what does the world look like if that's the case? Peter, of course, runs the X Prize Foundation, where we give large public prizes wherever there are market failures. So he launched the Space X Prize, which was a $10 million prize for anybody that could send a private plane up into space. The Virgin Galactic is the result of that. And now we have SpaceX and a bunch of nano-satellite companies. And from a $10 million prize, we now have a $2 billion commercial space industry around the world. So X Prize tries to fund prizes wherever there are market failures and can galvanize a whole industry. I just joined the board last year of XPRIZE, which has some interesting people on it. Every board meeting starts with, what did Elon just do? And then we move on to the rest of the business of the day. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. But if you lift up to the highest level, we're seeing today maybe the biggest transition in society and in civilization that we have ever seen. Certainly in our lifetimes and certainly in our memories. And the conclusion and observation that we have is that civilization as we know it is breaking down today. And so the question is, why is it happening? Is it happening? And as I said, most importantly, what can we do about it? And it starts, as I said, with this paradigm and is driving everything. But that doubling pattern that we've seen in computation is now in about a dozen technologies. We now have a dozen technologies that are doubling in the same way that Moore's law is doubling. In neuroscience, the resolution at which we can image the brain is doubling every year. Drones are doubling every 9 months in their capability. And we've never seen this before. In the history of our world, at any point in time, maybe one technology is accelerating or another. Now we have a dozen of them all at the same time. And it's very hard to see this happening. All of our education, training, intuition about the world teaches us linear extrapolation. If you're running a business, you take your past performance, you draw a line, here's where I could be. But on an information heuristic, the world operates on a very different curve, right? Alibaba, on their big sales day, sold $38 billion of product in one day. And it's such an incredible number, we cannot conceive of it. Our brains cannot register this number. It's insane. And yet it's happening, right? And so this is what we're seeing across the board. And we're seeing, as a result of all of these technologies, 4 major dynamics happen. The first is pretty obvious. We're digitizing the world very quickly. We're attaching sensors onto anything that moves. We're tracking the data streams and using AI to make sense of it. We had about 5 million digital connected devices 20 years ago, and now we have 50 billion, soon going to 1 trillion, right? And so that's a huge number. Now we're tracking all sorts of new data streams coming off our bodies, and we're digitizing healthcare and making it more personal, more predictive. When you digitize, things become very, very disruptive. And the best metaphor we have found for this framing and this transition is photography. Some of you are old enough to actually remember cameras and film photography. And you're operating from a scarcity model, right? The chemical image on the film. And when you're operating from film photography, you're operating from a scarcity environment, and you get a whole bunch of business models around that scarcity. People sell very expensive cameras, or I offer courses in photography. I might publish books on composition to help people optimize for that scarcity, because each click is costing about €1 a photograph, right? But then you move to digital photography, you move to the information-based environment, and 3 fundamentally important things happen in that transition. First, marginal cost goes to 0. Now I can take 1 million photographs, the cost doesn't change at all. That's really interesting. As a result of that cost dropping, the domain explodes. So in film photography, I'm very carefully clicking here, clicking there. He's holding the button down on that camera and never letting go, because it's free. He can take 1 million photographs and just pick the 3 that are good. But the most important thing is you change the problem space. So in a scarcity problem environment, as I said, each click is costing €1, and we have all these business models that crop up around scarcity. You go to the digital model, and the problem is different now. The problem now is we have 8 copies of our photographs on 10 devices, and nobody can find anything, right? And you've gone from a sourcing problem to a filtering problem. Most importantly, none of these old businesses make money anymore. All the incumbents are optimized towards the material scarcity linear model of the world. And if you take that a step further, think of this idea. Almost every business in the world for 5,000 years is based on scarcity. For the last few thousand years, if you don't have scarcity, you don't have a business. So you take an asset, a workforce, you put a legal boundary around that asset, and you sell access to scarcity. But as we digitize and we get technology delivering abundance, the business models have to change. And this is what we have to see. So the business world is fundamentally shifting. But let me give you a couple of ways of framing this. Here's a look at the cost of light over 700 years. And you can see it was very expensive to light up a building or a room with torches. I call this Game of Thrones technology. Then we invent candles and it plateaus for a while. And then we find electricity and it crashes to near zero, right? And so we've seen this incredible drop in cost in the cost of lighting a room. Now we barely notice it. What's interesting is the shape of this curve, because here's the same shape of the curve in DNA sequencing. Very expensive, plateaus, and then literally crashes. Here's the same shape of the curve in solar energy. And in technology after technology, the cost is crashing to near zero. And this is, again, something very unique. In the entire history of our world, advanced technologies always cost a lot. They were very expensive, and only a big corporate lab or a government lab could afford to do R&D, product development, etc. Today, for the first time in history, advanced technologies are very cheap. Anybody can now innovate. The blockchain is open source and free. And so this creates a completely different paradigm for how we do this. And just to give you a sense of this doubling pattern, I mentioned drones are doubling every 9 months. If you go back and look at some of my talks from 5-6 years ago on YouTube, you'll hear me say very excitedly that a drone can carry a 20-kilo package about 10 kilometers. That's the range and the capacity. But this doubling every 9 months. So it's gone from 20 to 40 to 80 to 160 to 320. And exactly on time, Boeing's new drone can carry 1,200 kilos. And there you see the doubling pattern. And the applications that come from this are profound. So here's somebody who's had a heart attack. You can now do something interesting, like send an ambulance drone across the sky, no traffic, without any disruption, very, very fast. The drone lands. It has the right equipment for that medical condition. In this case, a defibrillator, because it's a heart condition. This young lady picks it up, takes it inside. Inside is a camera operator, a medical expert looking from inside, so they can, now you don't need the medical technician in the ambulance, and they can basically apply urgent medical care in less than 2 minutes. And the cost of this compared to an ambulance is nothing, right? And so huge paradigm shifts start to occur if you can think about how we apply these. But the biggest disruption that we're seeing, and certainly the biggest disruption we will see in our lives, and the biggest transition, is the transformation of solar energy. Because it turns out solar energy is riding this doubling pattern, doubling every 22 months in its capability, roughly every 2 years. And it's been doing this, if you can see the numbers, it's been doing this for 40 years. For 40 years, every 2 years, we double the capability of solar energy price performance. This has unbelievable implications. On this curve, if you ride this out, we will be able to deliver 100% of world energy supply with solar in 11 years, by about 2030, 2031, which has massive geopolitical consequences, right? The Middle East collapses. The U.S. has to find other reasons to go to war, etc. Russia, the only asset Russia has is oil and gas. What do they do? So huge implications there. Here's the relative cost of solar to other fuels. You can see the unbelievable multiplier there. And this keeps going, right? And there are two very important things about this curve. Remember, I said that once you have a doubling pattern, it doesn't stop. So if we can deliver 100% in 11 years, and it's doubling every 2 years, that means in 13 years, we can deliver 200% of our energy needs. In 15 years, we can deliver 400%. In 17 years, we can deliver 800%. And that just keeps going. So energy, which has been scarce for the entire existence of humanity, is now about to become abundant. And that has incredible implications. And by the way, if you're worried there's not enough solar energy out there, it turns out if you add up all of our fossil fuels in the whole world, all the coal, all the oil, all the natural gas, and add it up, that adds up to 5 days of sunlight hitting the world. So it shifts the conversation instantly from a scarcity problem to a conversion problem, and the conversion is riding this doubling pattern. And we're starting to see this now. A big chunk of the farms in California are now fully solar powered. Chile, in South America, Chile today, the country is generating so much solar energy, they're giving it to the neighboring countries for free. That's happening right now. right? Because they have so much. What do you do with it? Give it away. Okay? And maybe the craziest irony I've seen, the Coal Museum in Kentucky is using solar energy to power itself. And that's just the weirdest thing ever. Right? And, how do you look in the mirror is my question here. And when you see these huge inflections, you tend to see these very weird things that don't make sense. And this indicates a broad transition happening. Now the big challenge is storage. How do you store all this energy? So utilities are pumping water up hills and then using hydro at night. Lithium-ion batteries have dropped in cost 90% in the last 10 years. Right? And so huge implications there. So we're seeing just in energy this massive transition happening right now in front of our eyes. Enormous implications. So I tried to live this myself. If you're going to talk about this, you have to have some experiential basis for it. So 3 years ago, I took a Tesla, and I drove from Miami all the way to Toronto. And I would stop at the charging stations. When I got on the highway, I would hit the button for autonomous driving. And the car drove itself about 35% of the time. If there was construction, it got very confused, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was a fun trip, and I had a great time doing this. But more interestingly, 18 months later, I drove back. So here's the relative trip. It's a slightly shorter trip on the... Sorry, I've gone too far. It's a slightly shorter trip on the way back. 2 less stops because I took a shorter route. But look at this bottom row. This is amazing. When I drove it up, as I said, the car drove itself about 35% of the time. When I drove it back, same car, same sensors, is now driving itself 80% of the time. And that the difference is just better software, better analytics. That many more cars have mapped the roads. And there you see Moore's Law in live action, and an 18-month doubling, right? And so this is a huge consequence. This is something that you can't change your mind around. This leads to huge disruption. When you digitize, things get very, very disruptive. And we can talk a lot about the technology, but the broader implications are very profound. Let me go back to the car for a second. Think about this. I got into this car, which is basically a first-class train cabin, right? It drove me across the country 80% of the time by itself. And because the charging stations are free, the entire trip, 2,500 kilometers, cost me $0. It was free. Now when we go back and forth, I say to my wife, you fly, I'll take the car. I make like 60 conference calls. I load up with like 6 shawarmas, kebabs, and I just eat and talk all the way down. The car is driving itself, right? And I call this a Gutenberg moment. In the 15th century, the printing press appeared, the Gutenberg printing press, and fundamentally changed society. And I would argue that this fundamentally changes society. But we have 20 of these. The way we frame it today is we have 20 Gutenberg moments hitting us all at the same time because solar energy changes society. Autonomous cars completely changes society. Blockchain completely changes society. AI, drones, neuroscience breakthroughs, biotech breakthroughs. And we have never seen this before. So we have 20 Gutenberg moments all hitting us at the same time. And this is breaking all of our institutions. And I'll touch more upon this later, and we'll drill into it. But there's not a single institution that we can see that survives this, right? One conversation that we had at the Vatican is the business model for most religions is to sell heaven. And as we have life extension coming, how do you sell heaven? People aren't dying, right? And so that's an enormous challenge. How do we deal with that? Okay? And so we are seeing the major wholesale breakdown of all of our institutions. And this is also causing a huge economic factor because when we see what happens to an industry when you digitize, revenues drop off a cliff. They don't gradually slow down. They go along like this and they suddenly go boom. We saw in the newspaper business a 6 times drop in revenues in 2 years as we digitize news. The music business had the same thing, a 10x drop in revenues. And think about this. Look at the music industry for a second. 20 years ago, we had 6 or 8 major music studios selling cassettes, CDs, DVDs, selling scarcity, selling the product, the physical product, right? Then we digitize it. All those music studios pretty much disappear. And now you have 2 platforms, iTunes and Spotify, selling abundance on a subscription model. And that's the transition. So we go from selling a thing of scarce value to an act. So you're selling ownership. You go from ownership to access. And now I can access 50 million songs on iTunes for $10 a month. And that transition is what we'll see in the car industry, in the energy industry, as we move to different business models around this. The enormous challenge, and I mentioned this before, is cognitively we have a very difficult time with this. We cannot see this coming. All our projections are linear and the world is growing exponentially. And I want to give you two examples of this. When the Google car first came out 10, 11 years ago, the cost of the LiDAR, the GPS, the radar, the sensors added up to about $200,000 per car. And all the car companies looked at that and said, cute research project. But you'll never commercialize that. Who's going to pay $200,000? Except 2 years later, it was $100,000. 2 years later, it was $50,000. But still, the response was, who will pay $50,000 for all those sensors? Now we're below, because it went from 50 to 25 to 12 to 6 to 3, and we're now below $1,000 for all the sensors, and everybody's freaking out, right? And this is a challenge. The cost of this LiDAR unit at the top of this Prius cost $75,000 a few years ago, and now it's $50. Why? Because there's 2 or 3 technologies inside it. Each technology is dropping 50%. So if you have one technology, you have a 50% drop. 3 or 4, you have a massive drop. And I'll give you a little thought experiment. Go back 10 years ago to the car industry and tell them that this thing that costs $100,000 will basically be free in 10 years and wash the immune system. You'll get a white coat and some medicine and be asked to stand in a corner while they do the important work, right? No amount of German engineering is going to solve for free. You can't deal with this. Right? The next version, of course, will come out later this year and be this size. It'll dematerialize the way our GPS receivers have dematerialized. But this is my favorite chart that describes this. So what you see here in the black is the actual growth of solar energy over the last, say, 20 years. Actually, boom, exploding up and to the right, complete exponential growth. So the black line is the actual growth of solar energy. What you see in the colored lines here is the projections from the top energy experts in the world as to what will happen with solar. Okay? This is from the International Energy Agency called the World Energy Outlook. And so you see here in 2008, this is their projection. 2009, this is their projection. 2010, it goes up like this, but the projections go linear. Here's 2015, boom, it's linear. Let me show you 2016, linear. 2017, linear. 2018, he goes down. Like if solar energy is going like this, how do you predict usage will go down? Like how do you get there, right? And these are the top energy gurus in the world. And this is a cognitive issue. This is not a mathematical issue. We are not able to see this thing. And the more experienced you are in that field and the more depth of expertise, the less you will believe the breakthrough. Now, all of our organizations have, and all of our governments have people that have 10, 20, 30 years of experience in that domain. And when they see this, they can't see it. And I could show you 20 examples of this in mobile phone expansion, data storage, bandwidth, et cetera, et cetera. When you have exponential growth, the experts in that domain simply don't see it. They all go linear, every single one. That's the paradigm, that's the breakage we have to break through. And the reason this is unstoppable is because as the cost of all of these technologies drops, a domain becomes digital, the costs go to zero, you get open source communities forming, and then you get radical disruption of the status quo. And whether it's drones or biotech or Bitcoin, they're all going through this same process. And you can't beat this process. You can't beat free. Right? So today, any entrepreneur can enter a legacy environment with a beginner's mind, leverage new technologies, and totally disrupt it. This is one of my favorite examples. This is a fishing village in Vietnam. And once a month, a big ship would come to deliver diesel fuel for the fishing boats. And at one point, the ship stopped coming because it didn't make sense. And so these poor fishermen have no diesel fuel for their fishing boats. So they research the internet. They order a solar panel. They hook it up using the instructions on the internet to their propeller, and they invent a solar-powered boat. So here you have cutting-edge technologies used in a very disruptive way happening at the edge of civilization. We get really excited when we see this, because when these guys get their hands on drones and biotech and CRISPR, things are going to get very, very interesting. Okay? Elon Musk is probably the best example of this. Many of you know the Hyperloop. He wants to shoot from LA to San Francisco in about 20 minutes at about 6,000 kilometers an hour. Now, Elon has no experience in the car energy sector, the car industry, the space sector. His methodology is very simple. He looks at a technology that's growing exponentially. He looks 10 years out. Where will that technology be on a 10-year doubling pattern? And then let's build a company to intercept that curve, because it takes about 10 years to build a solid operating company. That's it. So he just keeps repeating that model. And to give you a sense of the mindset, I was chatting with him about this Hyperloop. And I said, Elon, I have a degree in theoretical physics. If you accelerate a human being from 0 to 6,000 kilometers an hour and then decelerate them back to 0 in 20 minutes, you're probably going to kill them. And his answer was, yeah, it's an issue. It's an issue, right? In this example, I'm the expert. I'm going, you can't do that. You should stop. And he's like, no, we have to overcome that problem, right? And this is the mentality now. Thousands of entrepreneurs are now operating from this mentality. And what's coming out of the world is magical now. Vitalik Buterin, 18 years old, his professors tell him, you can't do that. And he goes and creates Ethereum. And most of the banking infrastructure in the future will be running on something like Ethereum. Bitcoin, I think, is one of the most fascinating things out there. Think of it as digital gold. That's the best way to think about it. We've now proven nobody's been able to hack it for 10, 12 years, so it's going to be very powerful. Really where it becomes powerful is microtransactions, but I won't get heavily into that here. We can talk about it in the Q&A. I would put Bitcoin blockchain about here. The technologies have now converged, and we're about to see an explosion in products and services coming from that. So, okay, we have a dozen technologies moving at light speed. We have 20 Gutenberg moments. What do we do? How do we deal with this? And I want to talk about what this is doing to the world. So I think this has four major dynamics that are happening in the world as a result. The first, as I mentioned, we have these massive, this forcing function of technology. 20 of these major breakthroughs. The second is it breaks every institution. Education is broken. Journalism is broken. Monetary systems are breaking. Legal systems are breaking. Healthcare, intellectual property is broken. In fact, we cannot see a single institution that survives this. Third, our current leadership cannot deal with this. All of our leadership is trained in 20th century incremental, status quo, material, linear environments, and the train is pulling into Black Swan Station, right? And so we're not trained for this. We're trying to now train a new breed of leadership to navigate through disruptive times. And the final observation I have is almost all of the action, certainly most of the implementation of new ideas is happening at a city level rather than a country level. It's too complex now to manage a big country. And if you look at the biggest countries in the world, they're all a mess. A few hundred years ago, it was a huge advantage to have a big country. Lots of natural resources, critical mass in multiple industries, etc. But now it's a huge liability. Just like it's a huge liability to have a big company, a small company is much more agile. Today, it's a huge liability to be a big country. And if you think of our biggest cities in the world, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Shanghai, Tokyo, they're bigger and more complex than any country was 100 years ago. Right? And in a city, everybody kind of knows where they fit. And so we think we go back to kind of an older Greek model of navigating our world at a city level. Pretty much the mayors run the world today because you can do things at the local level. And I want to come back to this institution to really drill this home. Let's talk about capitalism and the economy. About 5-6 years ago, we had about 50 trillion in GDP globally, and the world was about 150 trillion in debt. In the last 5 years, we've grown GDP to about 90 trillion in GDP, and the world is 300 trillion in debt. Okay? So just let's do the math there. In 5 years, we've grown global GDP by 50 trillion, but we've increased debt by 150 trillion. So we're putting ourselves exponentially more into debt to give ourselves this much more GDP. Right? So I'll give you a little experiment. Go to a bank and say, please lend me $1,000 because I'll make $150 from that $1,000. And watch the answer, right? So our economic systems are going to break at some point. We're running the world on debt and it will not sustain. Take education. All our education systems are designed to take a young child, train them through their early 20s to be ready for the existing job market, right? Except small problem. We have no idea what a job looks like in 5 years. What are we teaching them? In fact, at Singularity University, we noticed that if you are doing a master's degree today in one of these topics like advanced robotics or biotech or neuroscience, literally by the time you finish your master's degree, you're out of date. Because the technology is moving faster than our ability to teach it. That's a structural issue. And so the way we dealt with that is we had a real-time curriculum development methodology. And so this is the incredible breakage. Let's take democracy. We run most of the world with representative democracies. And we invented that a few hundred years ago when information was scarce. If you were in Washington, D.C., you literally had no idea what was happening in California. The speed of a horse was as fast as you could find out. So Congress meets occasionally to give people time to ride across the country and say, here's what my people are thinking. Today we have an abundance of information. It gets misused, misinterpreted, faked, and every major democracy in the world is broken. India broken, Brazil broken, the UK broke 3 years ago, the US breaking in front of our eyes. Why? Because the metabolism of a democracy is too slow for the changes in the world, driven by technology. Right? And so we can't deal with this effectively. And so how do we handle that? On the lighter note, take marriage as a nice, fun example. We invented marriage as a social institution about 9,000 years ago. And when that first surfaced as a huge social structure, average human lifespan a few thousand years ago was about 23 years old. So you got married and you had kids and you died. Marriage is not supposed to last 50, 60 years. The institution wasn't designed for it. The institution was designed to keep the husband and wife together till the kids reached adulthood, and then you're supposed to die. Right? You're not supposed to stay together for 50 years. Now we're about to double human lifespan in the next 10, 20 years. So in 20 years, if you get married, are you supposed to stay with the same person for 100 years? Right? My wife calls it state-sanctioned torture. Basically, that's and yet if you talk about divorce, everybody goes, oh God, that's a terribly bad thing. But the institution doesn't fit for the time it was created. And this is true for all of these. In the UN Security Council is designed to mitigate conflicts between countries. Except 80% of armed conflict today is civil wars, and the UN says that we can't do anything about that. Right? And there's not a single institution, and I challenge you, is there a single institution in the world today that's actually working well? And I can't see it. In fact, they're all going the wrong way. Right? So we're breaking all of our institutions. So we wrote this book basically saying, okay, we're seeing a new way of organizing, and it's now being used by companies, and about 35 heads of state, it turns out, are now using the book to run themselves. And the problem that we've been working on is how do you solve this immune system problem? Because if you can't solve that immune system problem and the backlash from the legacy environment, it doesn't matter what new technology we have. And it's bad in companies, but it's much worse in the public sector. Bankers are fighting Bitcoin, taxis are fighting Uber, etc. So we created a process that we run in big companies. It takes 10 weeks in a big company. We're able to move leadership culture, management thinking 3 years ahead in 10 weeks. Piloted it with Procter & Gamble. We've done it a bunch of times, Sareb here in Spain, and a bunch of other companies, Visa, HP, Black & Decker, etc. Then we said, okay, we've solved it in the private sector. And where's Emily? Emily here runs that process. Then we said, okay, can we solve this in the public sector? Because in the public sector, existing policy is the immune system. So we formed a nonprofit out of Miami, and we've run it 6 times in the public sector with in Medellin, in Colombia, with the mayor of Miami to solve public transportation, and most recently with the justice system and the Supreme Court in Colombia to transform the justice system in Colombia. It takes 16 weeks because it's public sector, but it works. And we're excited enough about the process that we open sourced it. And so we wrote a handbook with Francisco Palau, my co-founder is Spanish, from Granada, which is just about Spanish, right? And so we wrote this book saying, here's a handbook on how you can apply this entire process in your company, in your organization. It gives you step by step. Because every organization, every institution in the world has to solve this problem, and we'll never get to them. So let's just open it up. And so what we're thinking about now is, okay, if we solve this immune system problem, how do we then solve society at scale? And we literally need to navigate this in a very profound way, because every institution in the world needs to transform. Every NGO, every big corporation needs to fundamentally transform. Our people need to transform. Our leadership needs to transform pretty fundamentally, right? At the very worst case, the biggest forcing function is climate change. We're very, very, very worried about. We're not worried about energy scarcity, water scarcity, food scarcity, resource scarcity at all, because everything is going to abundance. We're really worried about climate change because the data, we don't know how to model it very well. And I was talking to one of our astronauts, and he said the thickness of the atmosphere around the world, around the Earth, is the equivalent of the thickness of the skin of an apple on the apple. So next time you cut an apple, look at how thin the skin is, and that's the atmosphere that we have, and we're polluting the hell out of it. So how do we deal with this is what we're thinking about now. And we have some interesting possibilities, and I want to run you through 3 examples of how one can go about addressing these big structural changes using technology, but it requires a different mindset. So this is a prize we launched 3 years ago. It's called the Water Abundance X Prize. And the prize was, can you create a machine that will extract clean water out of the atmosphere, like a reverse air conditioner, and condense it out of the atmosphere? But you have to be able to do 2,000 liters a day, enough for an apartment building or a village, using only renewable energy, and it has to cost less than 2 cents a liter. So that was a challenge. Right? And so when we put a challenge like this out, we frame it and put the parameters so that it lasts for about 7-8 years, and we try and have it solved in about 7-8 years. It gives teams multiple times and multiple tries. 3 years in, a year and a half ago, a team popped up and said, we've done it. And we tested it, and they've done it. We awarded the prize. So we now have a machine that can extract clean water out of the atmosphere at less than 2 cents a liter. And now we solve basically the water problem. Now it's a distribution problem. How quickly can we get that machine out there? And except if you're in a desert environment, it works very, very well. And so as long as you have more than about 20% humidity, there's enough water to extract, and that is okay. Also, the ripple effect is if you have clean water, you get rid of about half of the diseases in the world. So the ripple effects go very, very quickly. So this is water. Okay, this is why we're not so worried about water scarcity. We live on a water planet, for God's sakes. And at the worst case, as the cost of energy goes to zero, desalinization becomes easy, because the big cost in desalinization is the energy. Here's another example. I was talking to the mayor of Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka. And they had just signed a deal for $500 million loan from the Chinese to expand the port. The city has grown 3 times. They need a lot more food and equipment and supplies, etc. So they took on this huge project to expand the port. $500 million. It was going to take about 6 years to expand the port. So I ran on the back of an envelope 3 calculations that we've since ratified. So a drone today can carry 1,000 kilos. The average weight of a container is about 20,000 kilos. So if you weigh 3 doublings, a drone goes from 2,000 to 4,000 to 8,000. And in 3 doublings, a drone can carry several thousand kilos. And if you have a drone picking up 4 drones picking up the corner of a container, you can just pick up a container off the ship and put it on a train, put it on a truck. You don't need a port, right? So now you don't need a port. You just float up near it. The drone picks it up, and you have something like this that occurs. You have something like this, and 3 doublings is 27 months. So instead of $500 million, 6 years, you basically wait for drones to do the job for you in 3 doublings, just about 2 years. and you don't even need to build a port. That's the mindset shift that can occur. And I don't know if we have Miguel here. Is Miguel here? So you have one of our favorite alumni from Singularity University, Miguel Luengo Oroz, who joined the World Health Organization and was looking at malaria. And today, to test for malaria, you get a blood test, a blood sample from a patient. Somebody looks at the blood sample in a microscope and literally has a counter counting out how many parasites there are in the blood sample. That's the way we detect malaria today. And obviously, in developing countries and third world countries, we don't have the equipment, we don't have the experts, the disease spreads because we're not detecting it early enough. So he thinks about it from this perspective and says, surely there's a better way, comes up with a game called malariaspot.org, and you can check it out. And somebody would take a picture of a blood sample, upload it, and people play a point-and-shoot game to shoot the parasites. If 13 people play the same blood sample, you get 100% accuracy. And he ran a trial, and in 1 month, he was able to detect malaria in 250,000 people globally at a cost of zero. Because the traditional response is we need more equipment, more labs, more experts, et cetera. And you look at it in a different way, and you can solve that problem at zero cost. To their credit, the World Health Organization made him global head of their malaria labs. So he's doing that now. But I'll give you one more example. This is an entrepreneur from Barcelona who runs this company called Wellways. Wellways has created this is to detect breast cancer. And so you put this pad on, it's about this big. A woman would put it on left and right sides. It does a very extensive temperature sensing across that part of the body. And it uploads, you take a picture of it with a barcode, and it uploads the image. And we use AI to detect the temperature between left and right. And you do it every 6 months, and it checks the delta from 6 months ago. This turns out to be 80% better at detecting breast cancer than a mammogram. No radiation. Costs about $20, and it's FDA approved. They've run the clinical trials. It's FDA approved. So if we can distribute this, we solve breast cancer globally. Right? And so this is what's possible today with a slightly different mindset shift. The question is, how do we get society at scale to adopt that mindset shift? Because the minute you try and say this, all the doctors will go, no, this can't possibly work. Right? For example, 2 years ago in Texas, the state of Texas banned telemedicine because the Doctors Guild lobbied and said, you have to go to a doctor for everything. And so that's the Luddite revolt. That's the backward thinking. Right? And what we're seeing in the world, as technology is accelerating, it's creating a lot of uncertainty. So the orthodox element of every religion, Muslim radicals, Christian evangelicals, Jewish settlers, Hindu fanatics in India, all going crazy. They're all going, I can't take this. Let's go back to an older time when things were more simple. Because people would much rather be comfortable than happy. Right? And so, but if you can be a little uncomfortable and try different things, you have a radically different result. We have pretty good understanding now of how radically technology can improve the world. In fact, it may be it's certainly a major driver of progress in the world. And you could argue that technology is the only major driver of progress in the world. And now that we have a dozen technologies moving this quickly, we get very excited. The question is, how do you implement this quickly and effectively into society? And that's the challenge. So you can see in these examples that we're digitizing, disrupting, democratizing, demonetizing, et cetera, And I'll end on this thing. How many of you are familiar with the Gartner hype cycle? Can I see your show of hands? So Gartner put out a chart saying every technology goes through a curve where people see a technology like 3D printing or Bitcoin, get very, very excited about it. Then the reality hits that this is really hard. And then people go, oh, no, it's never going to work. And then things happen. Finally, it just actually delivers, and you don't notice. Right? So 3D printing is about here today. Bitcoin is about here today, et cetera. And so they have this curve. And it's a standard emotional curve of acceptance from a psychological perspective. I argue that the Industrial Revolution kind of led us to a massive peak of GDP, wealth globally, et cetera, And we created a lot of structures, nation states, global economies, et cetera, to deal with this mobile workforce, university training. We've kind of tipped over the edge, and global society is going down the other side. And we have to figure out how to minimize this trough in amplitude and wavelength. How do we minimize this? And for that, we need new leaders, new projects to minimize this curve. If you look at every major civilization in the world in our history, the Romans, the Mayans, the Incas, all of them got to a very sophisticated level. But then they hit a boundary condition and they all collapsed, right? And if you talk to the Yuval Hararis and the Pikettys of the world, we're at that point now. Many of the conditions that led to the Roman Empire collapsing, etc., exist today. And we have to figure out how to not go through 500 years of the Dark Ages. That's our job. So with that, thank you very much.